purpose of this video is to develop your understanding of the context of Alex Garland's The Beach. The material in here is largely drawn from the introduction by John Niven to the 2016 edition of the novel. Here we'll be looking at how the novel is a critique and a representation of Generation X, and also how it might be read by a new generation of millennials. In order to understand where the beach sits in terms of its context, we need to understand what the term Generation X means. Here we're talking about that generation of people who are the children of baby boomers. Now, baby boomers are the children of the World War II generation. So Generation Xers were born in the 60s up until the early 80s. I mean, really, we'd probably talk in the mid to late 70s at the latest, really. Their parents went to Vietnam or protest against the war. And these people came of age in an analog world. So we're talking about a world of cassettes and VHS, TV and radio. I mean, TV at a time when TV shows were on at specific times. There was no such thing as binge watching. The musical taste ranges of this group of people are varied. But to get a sense of the flavour, we're talking about punk music of the 80s, like stuff like The Cure, to early grunge, and that's Pearl Jam and Nirvana. We're considering early rap music, like the Snoop Doggy Dogg sort of music, perhaps, the early good Snoop Doggy Dogg, that is, or the pop music of early Madonna, Michael Jackson, Wham. I mean, it's just a snapshot of the kind of musical taste of Generation X. And so if there are any Gen Xers out there listening, then they're probably going to be offended by this. But the three images on the right hand side here, I think, kind of capture the kind of range of people here through these three films. The Breakfast Club is about high schoolers in the 80s. Then we have Reality Bites, university age or university graduates in the 90s. And then you have the Friends cast. It just baffled me blew my mind when I thought about it, that the Friends cast are Generation X. And so you can see here that movement from the 80s in high school, the early 90s, the graduation from college, and then into adulthood in terms of the cast of Friends. It kind of captures who this generation refers to. One of the key reasons I mention Generation X here, or focus on that, is this quote from Nick Hornby. He described the beach as a Lord of the Flies for Generation X. Now, throughout reading The Beach, you'll see that there are a lot of war references to it. Now, let's put this in a generational perspective, and let's go back to Norman Mailer's The Naked and the Dead. Norman Mailer wrote that novel at the same age as Alex Garland, and it's based on his experiences of the Philippines in World War II. Now, to put this in perspective, for Richard, the narrator of The Beach, the Philippines is just another place he's visited. But for Norman Mailer, this was a place where he went to war. And then we have the children of that World War II generation. So if Norman Mailer is that World War II generation, then Tim O'Brien is that baby boomer generation who went to Vietnam. Tim O'Brien wrote If I Die in a Combat Zone, Box Me Up and Ship Me Home, based on his personal experiences of the Vietnam War. And so we have the World War II generation who experienced the jungle and left home to go away to war. Their children left home and went away to war. And then we'll have the Gen Xers who didn't do that. And we see this in the opening of the novel, where we're immediately reminded that Richard's whole construct of the world is a pastiche of images and quotes from Vietnam films. A pastiche is kind of like a collage. It's a stitching together of images and ideas. And here we have a quote: dropping acid on the Mekong Delta, smoking grass through a rifle barrel, flying a helicopter with opera blasting out of the loudspeakers, tracer fire and paddy field scenery, the smell of napalm in the morning. This is from the opening of the novel. This is the first image we get. And this is a mixture of quotes and images from several Vietnam films, most predominantly Apocalypse Now. The opera blasting out of the loudspeakers is from a famous scene in Apocalypse Now, as is that last point, the smell of napalm in the morning. The quote in Apocalypse Now is, I love the smell of napalm in the morning. The image of smoking grass through a rifle barrel comes from Platoon. So it's this mishmash stitching together of images that of the Vietnam War, because Richard's whole understanding of the war is mediated through film rather than experience. We see that later in the novel as well, where we hear from Richard, there was nothing strange about it. Jed and I were on a covert mission. We had binoculars, jungle, a quarry, a threat, the hidden presence of AK-47s and slanted eyes. The only missing element was a Doors soundtrack. This harks back to that film Apocalypse Now Again, where the Doors soundtrack, specifically the song The End, is central to that film, and this bizarre scene at the end where the Martin Sheen's character is killing the character played by Marlon Brando with a machete, with Doors music playing in the background. So how does this relate to Generation X? Well, this novel both speaks to and critiques the values of Gen X. The Generation Xers gave us backpacking, and that's not just traveling, that's the competitive one-upmanship of going to that unique place, that authentic experience, the place going somewhere before it became flooded by tourists. It's a bit shallow, and Alex Garland is very, very much critical of that. And the essay I mentioned in the introduction by John Niven really does point to that. In this novel, the premise speaks to a world where the digital has yet to invade. We have Daffy giving a hand-drawn map to Richard, and Richard figuring it out through his use of maps and that analog, tactile way of finding things, that there is still the possibility of an uncharted adventure in this world. There is no Google Maps. There is no GPS to find the way. This is still a world where there is still some mystery. There are some places that have yet to be found. When we ask how this novel might work had it been written for millennials, we quickly discover that it doesn't work. It could not be written in the current time because it is so grounded in that analog world of Gen Xers. But could this novel find a new audience because it comes from a world where mystery is still possible, away from geotagging, selfies and hyperconnectedness? Could Richard's story unearth a longing for disconnectedness? For millennials, an audience where they are hyper-connected through the internet and geotagging and all that sort of stuff, there comes with it a certain anxiety, a longing for a world where that doesn't exist, a simpler time, or one where there is time out. So the beach can find a new audience and speak to millennials in a way that is different from how it was written for Gen Xers. I mention this because in an exam you might be asked a question, you might approach a question about how a text can shift in meaning across generations, or how it can be written in one context and read in another. And you can compare and contrast the values of that Generation X that the novel is critiquing and your generation, the millennial generation, approaching this novel, and how do you relate to it, coming from a world that has, well, your generation really hasn't lived in an analog world. You've been digital from birth. Now that's a bit of an oversimplification, I know, but it's an interesting way of considering the varying contexts of this novel.